Today we're going to be talking about how it is that we worship and what our churches look like. Now we've got some very, very detailed videos on this, both about our church structure we're working on and also about our Divine Liturgy. But today we're just going to go through a primer on each of these. So the first thing that I want to point out is how similar they are, how similar worship is between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You can see on this comparison table coming up, there's prayer and there's sacrifice and there's a category of other things that we use. So the prayer, there's chanting of hymns in Old and New Testament, there's silent prayer, Old and New Testament, there's prostrations, there's a liturgical calendar. If you go down the bottom, images are used, there's fasting, there's confession of sins, there's formalized reading of scriptures, and there's 3 sections to the building. So all of those are both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. There are a few changes. So because in the Old Testament had a different focus, and it was from before Christ was here on earth and before he was crucified and rose to heaven, there's a few differences here. The animal sacrifice has now been replaced with what we would term to be the bloodless sacrifice. It's reliving that sacrifice that Christ made on the cross. So we don't need to offer sacrifices anymore. That's been done. So there is that change between old and new. There's also the sacrifice now is placed on the altar. Previously it wasn't. It was placed on what was called the fiery altar, but it was never placed on the Holy of Holies, which is where our worship is focused on now. And so those explain the big changes to our services between Old Testament and New Testament, but still you can see a great continuity there. Now we've got here a slide for how our church looks. You can see on the left hand side that there's the altar, and in the middle is the nave, and in the narthex on the right hand side. There's quite a lot of things to take in here. Firstly, the dome is up the top. Now standard Orthodox Church architecture has the dome as being a normal part of the church building. So you've got the altar at the front, but you've got the dome above you. There's also what's written here as choros, which is the chandelier. Then you've got the iconostas, the icon screen that separates the altar and the nave. You've got quite a number of things in the altar, and some seating available in the nave, with some being available at the front of the church. Now there's a lot that we can go through about this, but suffice it to say this is roughly what an Orthodox church building would look like. Sometimes we get questions about iconography, and they're fair questions. And they're usually asked in a manner that evokes one of the commandments, which talks about idolatry, and how idolatry is a bad thing. There's videos that I can point to about why iconography is in fact the right and proper thing to have in worship. But suffice it to say that we can look at some of the old synagogues, and these had depictions of holy events as well. So, without going into too much depth and detail, we can see plainly that the making of images was never forbidden and was in fact a positive thing in the context of our worship. So, to summarize, the Old Testament and the New Testament's worship each have prayer, fasting, and sacrifice as fundamental parts of its worship. Each are divided into 3 between the Old Testament and our churches today. This is still retained, and each have confession, each have a liturgical calendar. Although these look differently nowadays, they're still nonetheless done and practiced in both the Old Testament temple and the New Testament church. As we said, we've got plenty of videos available to talk about the liturgy. Here we have it in one slide. We go all the way from the preparation services, where we prepare the bread and wine, and that happens before the start of the liturgy, through what is sometimes called the liturgy of the catechumens, which is done, which is the start of the liturgy, and it includes the readings and the sermon and some prayers for people in our community, and ends with a litany of prayer for the catechumens themselves. Then immediately after that is what's sometimes called the Liturgy of the Faithful, and the central focus point of that is communion, is the body and blood of Christ, both consecrating it and partaking of it. And these are the most important things in our liturgy. Thanks very much for listening, everyone. I really appreciate it. I hope you subscribe below, and I look forward to seeing you on our next video. Thanks.